What do these stories have in common? Citizens overrunning the president's home and jumping in a swimming pool. Protesters spreading manure on government offices. President Zelensky making deals with the World Economic Forum. Justin Trudeau funding crickets. Farmers charged with the new tax on cow burps. If you answer they all relate to stakeholder capitalism, you'd be right. I read Klaus Schwab's book so you don't have to. Much of the news these days revolves around Klaus Schwab. You may have seen him give a speech at the latest G20 conference, then rubbing shoulders with heads of state in the hallway. But more news is driven by politicians following controversial policies based on recommendations of Schwab's World Economic Forum.
Names like Mrs. Merkel, even Vladimir Putin and so on, they all have been young global leaders of the World Economic Forum. But what we are very proud of now is the young generation, like Prime Minister Trudeau, President of Argentina and so on, is that we penetrate the cabinets. Today I was at a reception for Prime Minister Trudeau, and I know that half of this cabinet, or even more half of this cabinet, are actually young global leaders of the World Economic Forum.
That's true in Argentina as well.
It's true in Argentina, and it's true in France now.
We'll get back to those news stories later. But first, let's talk about the book. Stakeholder Capitalism, Essential Knowledge. Number 1, it's very badly written. And you would expect Schwab would explain the concept in the first chapter. Instead, the concept is in chapter 8. Honestly, you could skip the first 146 pages and you won't miss Schwab's thesis. The first 6 chapters are essentially filler. Schwab's book titles, Stakeholder Capitalism, The Great Reset, and the Fourth Industrial Revolution, are buzzwords Schwab uses in his speeches to impress people who don't realize how shallow those books are. Schwab loves tangents and the non sequitur, often spending way too much time discussing minor or completely irrelevant points. Essential knowledge. Number 2, WEF believes in depopulation.
We cannot hide away from human population growth. All these things we talk about wouldn't be a problem if there was the size of population that there was 500 years ago.
In the book, Schwab notes the president of the Club of Rome gave the keynote speech at Davos in 1973. The Club of Rome was a think tank that published Limits to Growth in 1972, arguing the world was grossly overpopulated and disaster would strike without a worldwide drop in population and consumption. Schwab recounts the speech predicted a sudden and serious shortage of arable land in the next few decades. And the prediction was spectacularly wrong. Better agricultural practices and better seeds allowed crop yields to multiply without increasing acreage. Starvation and poverty dropped at the same time the population doubled. But incredibly, Schwab comes back in chapter 7 to say the Club of Rome was right all along. Essential knowledge number 3. Schwab's use of the term stakeholder capitalism is highly deceptive. Early in the book, stakeholder capitalism refers to companies that work not just to benefit their shareholders, but other stakeholders as well, notably their employees, clients, customers, local government, and communities. No controversy here, as even the greediest capitalists have to give customers value for their money and treat workers well enough to keep them from quitting or striking. Now, if you get bored and stop reading too early, you might get the false impression that stakeholder capitalism is business with a heart. But in chapter 8, Schwab tells us that stakeholder capitalism model doesn't work anymore. So in his new model, companies now have 2 stakeholders, the planet and people. Then he breaks down the people stakeholders into 4 groups: governments, civil society, companies, and the international community. He's pulled a switcheroo. He's no longer talking about stakeholders of companies. Suddenly, companies have become a stakeholder in something else. So when Schwab talks about stakeholder capitalism, it's not clear if he's talking about running a business, a government, or the entire human race. The civil society stakeholder is defined as unions to NGOs, from schools and universities to action groups, and from religious organizations to sports clubs. And the international community, consisting of international organizations such as the UN and others. So if you read the book to get an idea how you could be a better capitalist running your plumbing business or family farm, you get up to page 178 and learn that you're supposed to consult sports clubs and the UN. If that isn't weird enough, Chapter 9 is supposed to cover business leaders who best exemplify stakeholder capitalism. The 3 CEOs highlighted are all members of the World Economic Forum's Board of Trustees, which brings us to another essential concept. The book is not written to give you information, it is written to promote the World Economic Forum. Schwab's first hero, Jim Snabe, is praised for being the CEO of the software firm SAP, which in 2018 reached its goal of reducing its CO2 emissions by 50%. However, Snabe left the company in 2014. Yes, remember the dumpster fire. Now, if Schwab really wanted businesses to reduce their carbon, he could have taught us how SAP reduced theirs, even without Snabe. But no, the book is not written to give you information, it is written to promote the WEF. So for all we know, they might have outsourced part of their business, so you have the same carbon footprint, but it's done at another company's office. So Snabe moves to the shipping giant Maersk, where Schwab praises a 42% reduction in CO2 emissions. Impressive! Did they put sails on their ships to use renewable wind energy? No. Did they start making shipping containers out of renewables like wood instead of carbon-intensive steel? No. They only reduce their CO2 emissions by selling off their oil and gas divisions. Of course, this does nothing for the planet, as those divisions will have the same carbon footprint no matter who owns them. Jim Snabe presents himself as a saint, while the company buying the oil wells is the devil with the carbon footprint, even as Snabe buys fuel from that same devil to run his diesel ships and trucks. Schwab also praises Snabe for the attitude at Maersk. At first, Snabe had described Maersk like this: "We move boxes around, that's not a compelling purpose." But after deep thought, Snabe reinvented the company's purpose. So we create livelihoods by moving products anywhere in the world. With the combination of selling off divisions and redefining its purpose, its employees found a new reason to get out of bed in the morning, as Snabe said. So the essentials: Schwab is a drama queen prone to gross exaggerations. The second hero of Chapter 9 is Mark Benioff, CEO of Salesforce. Benioff literally opens Stakeholder Capitalism with a glowing review of the book on page Roman numeral I, even before the title page. How did that happen? "Hey Mark, I'm writing a book where I praise you in Chapter 9. I need you to write a glowing book review for it." "Sure thing, Klaus."
Believe me, ladies and gentlemen, this man is a god.
Schwab focuses on Benioff's efforts to help homeless people in San Francisco. Schwab refers to the book Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus. A public service announcement: don't throw rocks at any bus. Don't throw rocks, Google is awesome. You would think Schwab would like the Google bus for lowering the carbon footprint of employees. But instead he makes the leap that the people throwing rocks were homeless because of Google's monopolistic practices. So next, Mark Benioff is lobbying the European Commission to break up monopolistic tech giants. Yes, the European Commission. Yes, we're talking about the homeless in San Francisco. Remember, non sequitur, badly written dumpster fire. Schwab gives praise when Benioff decided to speak out in favor of a tax on large tech companies such as his own, which would help finance a structural solution for the homeless in the city. The Proposition C proposed a 0.5% tax on corporate revenue above $50 million. So to be clear, Benioff didn't draft Proposition C or campaign for it. He just agreed with it when someone else championed the cause. The talk is cheap, and 0.5% is a low number. Forbes says Benioff had a net worth of $7.7 billion. Others say it's $10 billion. He could have spent a small fraction of his fortune without sacrificing his lifestyle and made a huge impact on the homeless. Money for homeless shelters to get people off the streets, and build affordable housing for a long-term solution, rehab and addiction counseling for homeless addicts, job training for the unemployed. This one should be easy if they're already good enough to work for Google. And if Benioff doesn't want to pay personally, he could get Salesforce to pay, claim the expenses as a tax write-off, and score a major public relations victory for the company while helping thousands of desperate people. But of course, Benioff doesn't want to get involved with the plebs. So he'd rather pay a small tax and let City Hall bureaucrats deal with them, with the same City Hall that's failed the homeless for decades. So voters approved Prop C, but the tax hasn't been levied, so Benioff still hasn't paid anything. And Schwab wants us to believe this guy is a hero. The third and final champion of Chapter 9 is Larry Fink, who Schwab introduces as the founder and chief executive of BlackRock, an investment firm that managed more than $6 trillion, making it the largest private asset manager in the world. The real number was 11 trillion when the book came out. Schwab's figure was 3 years out of date at the time. So just a few pages earlier, Schwab was praising Jim Snabe, supposedly saving the planet by selling off oil and gas investments. What about Larry Fink? Well, BlackRock still owns $4.7 billion of Valero Energy.
How dare you!
$5.1 billion of Marathon Petroleum.
How dare you!
$11.5 billion of Phillips.
How dare you!
$24.3 billion of Chevron.
How dare you!
$32.2 billion of ExxonMobil.
How dare you!
Hundreds of other oil companies, the total could be $200 billion. Fink is the key guy in ESG scores, environment, social, governance. It's a system designed by WEF to evaluate companies and even countries. Fink makes money off this. He sells ESG mutual funds to investors who are willing to pay more fees if they think ESG companies are morally superior. Schwab explains, the planet pillar includes metrics on climate change, such as all relevant greenhouse gas emissions, and plans to get them in line with Paris targets. So it's a cruel joke that Klaus Schwab lauds Fink as an outstanding example of stakeholder capitalism, when Larry is well known for flying his Gulfstream private jet around the world, even when attending World Economic Forum meetings to address carbon dioxide emissions. The Gulfstream jet burns 450 gallons of fuel per hour, which is more than most car drivers burn in an entire year. Schwab further explains ESG. He's big on diversity and pay quality. So how does Larry Fink measure up on his own ESG scale for pay quality and CEO compensation? $36 million. That's 1,270 times what his cafeteria workers make. Larry's 36 mil to run a hedge fund company makes Klaus look silly. Since a year earlier, Schwab lamented hedge fund managers make a lot more money than life-saving doctors. How can it be that a person who has spent more than 10 years training to become a medical doctor and whose end-of-year results are measured in lives receives compensation that is meager compared to that of a trader or a hedge fund manager? The book doesn't elaborate much about the diversity and inclusion points, but in practice these lead to some bizarre results, like Coca-Cola training its employees to be less white, or companies that have to take note of their employees' sex lives to ensure sufficient LGBT quotas for a good ESG score. Despite Fink's hypocrisy with ESG, Schwab praises him for a letter to corporate execs in 2020 warning that Fink would punish them if they didn't push the official ESG agenda. Now, that's a serious threat because BlackRock already owns huge shareholdings in nearly every major corporation, often enough shares to get corporate execs sacked. By giving a bad ESG score to a company, Fink might be able to crash its stock price. So Schwab, Fink, and BlackRock wield a lot of power by controlling ESG. Follow WEF's beliefs about politics and climate change, or else. Fink even bragged about his ability to force his will on others. It sounds more like fascism than free enterprise. This brings us to Stakeholder Capitalism Essential number 6. The goal of ESG is to make the WEF a shareholder in your company. Warren Buffett is still resisting, as is Elon Musk. Strangely, while Schwab is claiming CO2 creates an existential threat for the planet, Tesla, the leader in zero-emission cars, isn't even listed on Fink's ESG index, while one of the top 10s in ESG ratings is ExxonMobil, perhaps the greatest fossil fuel producer in history. Complete hypocrisy. It's basically a club or a tribe. Exxon pays lip service to the ESG system. Elon Musk writes mean tweets. Hey, and Schwab doesn't say anything about Fink's business deals with the Chinese Communist Party. In 2021, BlackRock was the first company to be allowed to sell mutual funds in China. The company's financing construction in China, including the Belt and Road Initiative projects. Fink touted China's greatness to American investors, publicly recommending Americans triple their holdings of Chinese investments. Bad timing, those suckers would have invested just before the Chinese real estate collapse and a 75% drop in Chinese stock prices. So how does China stack up with ESG? Environment. China has the most CO2 emissions and continues to build more coal-powered plants. Social. The Communist Party doesn't care for Klaus's people pillar with diversity or inclusion. But look at the atrocious way they treat the Uyghurs. Governance. Total lack of transparency as the party runs propaganda against their own citizens, blocks foreign social media, lots of human rights violations. Let's go back to the earlier story, Zelensky's deals with the WEF for reconstruction. It turns out that Larry Fink will run this. And once Fink knows who will get reconstruction contracts, BlackRock can buy more shares of those companies. The perfect insider trading idea, all financed by taxpayers of various countries. Chapter 10 is called Communities, and Schwab spends the first 6 pages discussing COVID response in New Zealand. So what does that have to do with capitalism? Well, a good answer, the book is badly written, or tangents and non sequiturs, but in truth, stakeholder capitalism is not about capitalism at all. Real capitalism is about private ownership. But in Schwab's system, politicians are considered stakeholder capitalists, even when shutting businesses. Schwab praises then Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern for her willingness to crash the economy to fight COVID. And next she wanted to crash the economy again for the next so-called crisis. Ardern was the mastermind of the cow burp tax, blaming global warming on cow burps in agriculture. She went to war with her own farmers, placing restrictions on fertilizers in an attempt to lower food production, since the planet is a more important stakeholder than the people who need to eat. Ardern wasn't alone. The manure spreaders were protesting proposals in the Netherlands to seize land from thousands of farmers, aiming to cut GHG emissions by a third by cutting food production by a third. Soviet communism? No. This is stakeholder capitalism. Prime Minister Mark Rutte's glowing review of the book appears on page II. In Stakeholder Capitalism, my good friend Professor Klaus Schwab outlines an inspiring way forward in making the global economy more equitable, sustainable, and future-proof. A vision that fits in perfectly with all his efforts over the years to build a better world. Once again, Professor Schwab gives us food for thought and reflection with this fascinating book.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
The other stories we started with, Trudeau's cricket farm stems from Schwab's campaign to get people to switch from eating meat to eating insects. And the most tragic stakeholder capitalism story was Sri Lankan President Rajapaksa, a longtime supporter of WEF, who had an ESG score of 98% when he banned chemical fertilizers to fight global warming. Without fertilizer, crop yields plunged. The country couldn't feed itself and had to import the shortfall from countries that did use fertilizer. They ran out of money paying for the imports, declared bankruptcy, and Rajapaksa fled the country. And despite Sri Lanka's disasters, Canada, New Zealand, the Netherlands, and others still want to continue those same crazy policies. Now let's go to the middle of chapter 7. Schwab spends 4 pages talking about Ethiopia in great detail, particularly the city of Awassa, where he says only half the people have electricity and the most common vehicles are carts pulled by donkeys. Schwab laments that CO2 emissions in Ethiopia tripled from 2002 to 2017 as per capita GDP went from about 50 cents to almost $2 a day. And meanwhile, he says nothing about the thousands of coal-fired plants built in China in the same period. In fact, Schwab blames Ethiopians for any global warming we might get in the future. The same force that helps people escape from poverty and lead a decent life is the one that is destroying the livability of our planet for future generations. Schwab has lived 85 comfortable years in Europe. Piles of people visit him every year in their private jets. They burn tons of carbon a day. But he seems to have a problem that one day hardworking Africans might save up enough money to trade in their donkey for a moped. The hypocrisy is frightening. But why isn't the media also labeling Schwab as an anti-black racist? Chapter 7 begins and ends with quotes from 16-year-old Greta Thunberg. This is proof that stakeholder capitalism is not capitalism. Greta is a Marxist who wants to shut down entire industries. She despises private enterprise.
All you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth.
Greta claimed that the science was settled, but how could she judge the science? She hadn't even finished high school. She follows doomsters that have already been discredited. People say follow the science, but Schwab presents none. The chapter harps about CO2, but he doesn't quote any climate scientist to say exactly what the effects of CO2 will be or when they will be felt. Real information will lead to scrutiny, rational thought, debate, and nuance. That doesn't serve Schwab's plan. He profits from the blind faith in fear and doom. Schwab's message in Stakeholder Capitalism is that the entire world economy, governments, and institutions should reform themselves, reset, if you will, based on the ill-informed opinions of an angry Marxist teenager, even if that means laying off workers, throwing people into poverty, and starving millions.